Marcus's fingers were numb from the cold, but it wasn't December in Chicago that made them shake as he stared at the Steinway grand piano in the marble foyer. It was the memory of what those fingers used to do before everything fell apart. "Play this Beethoven and I'll leave," the old man said, gesturing toward the sheet music on the stand. His voice carried the kind of casual authority that came from never being told no. "My grandson insists I need to sign for the package personally, but I'm in the middle of something. Humor an old man. Play Sonata 14. First movement. If you can make it through without embarrassing yourself, I'll sign your little screen and you can go." The man wasn't joking. His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, waited with a kind of cruel curiosity. Behind him, through French doors, Marcus could see others. People in expensive casual wear, holding wine glasses, their conversation halted by whatever was happening in the entrance hall. Marcus's throat went dry. The package, some artisanal cheese set worth more than his weekly pay, sat on the console table between them. His delivery app was already counting down. 4 more stops before his shift ended. Rent was due in 6 days, and he was short by $300. "I don't—" Marcus started. "The Moonlight Sonata," the old man interrupted, his tone sharpening. "Surely you've heard of it. Most delivery drivers have smartphones. You could pull it up, fumble through it. I'm not expecting perfection, just effort, entertainment." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Consider it a tip opportunity." Something in Marcus's chest cracked open, not violently, but like ice breaking under weight it was never meant to hold. He hadn't touched a piano in 7 years, not since the night his mother died in their cramped apartment in Austin, her medical bills stacked on the kitchen table next to the acceptance letter from Juilliard that he'd never answered. Not since he'd sold his father's old upright piano to pay for her funeral. The piano in front of him now was worth more than every possession Marcus had ever owned, combined. Its black lacquer surface reflected the chandelier light like still water, and he could see his own face distorted in its polish, older than he felt, worn in ways that had nothing to do with age. "Sir, I really need to—" $500, the old man said flatly. "Play it, and I'll Venmo you $500 right now, plus whatever tip you were hoping for." Marcus's hand moved to his phone reflexively. $500 would cover rent, would buy him breathing room, would mean he wouldn't have to choose between gas money and groceries next week. It would mean he could finally replace the brake pads on his Honda that ground every time he stopped. The sound like a warning he couldn't afford to heed. But the piano sat there like an accusation. He set his phone down. His hands, rough from handling boxes and steering wheels, looked wrong in this house. Everything here looked wrong, too clean, too expensive, too far from the world he'd been living in. The chandelier above threw light that made his reflection in the polished piano surface look like a stranger. Through the windows beyond, Lake Michigan stretched gray and infinite, a reminder that some distances couldn't be crossed, no matter how far you reached. "I haven't played in a long time," Marcus said quietly. "Then today you start again." The old man pulled out his phone. "Clock's ticking, son. My guests are waiting." Marcus approached the piano the way someone might approach a grave. The bench was real leather, not the worn fabric of the one he'd grown up with. His delivery uniform, a purple polo with a grease stain near the collar, felt ridiculous against the elegance of the room. He could smell the lingering scent of whatever expensive meal they'd eaten, something with truffle oil and herbs he couldn't name. The sheet music was pristine, probably never played. Beethoven's Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, the Moonlight Sonata. He'd performed this piece at his conservatory audition when he was 17, in front of judges who'd called it technically proficient but emotionally restrained. His teacher had told him he played like he was afraid of the music, like he was holding something back. He'd spent the next 3 years trying to fix that, trying to find whatever emotional truth classical music demanded. And then his mother got sick, and emotional truth became something much simpler: survival. Truth became medical bills and insurance forms, and watching someone you love disappear by inches while you stood helpless. Marcus placed his fingers on the keys. They trembled. The ivory was cold under his touch, smooth in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. The first notes of the Adagio sostenuto were supposed to flow like water, each triplet figure soft and inevitable. Instead, his fingers fumbled, producing a harsh clang that made him wince. Behind him, someone in the other room laughed. The sound cut through him like glass. He stopped, his jaw clenched. The old man was watching him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been amusement. It was hard to tell with people like this, people whose wealth insulated them from understanding what humiliation actually felt like, people who saw struggle as entertainment, who could offer $500 like it was nothing because to them it was nothing. "Go on," the old man said softly. "No one's judging." But they were. Marcus could feel it. The weight of eyes from the other room, the expectation, the casual cruelty of being reduced to a performing animal for the amusement of people who would never remember his name. He thought about his mother, how she'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his piano lessons, how she'd believed in him with a certainty that bordered on religious faith, how she'd told him, even at the end, that his music was a gift that couldn't be wasted. Except he'd wasted it anyway. 7 years delivering packages, 7 years of letting his hands forget what they were made for. He started again. This time, he didn't think about the money or the watching strangers or the 7 years of silence. He thought about his mother, how she used to sit in their apartment's tiny living room while he practiced, her eyes closed, her face peaceful even when the cancer was eating her alive. He thought about how she'd told him, the week before she died, that music wasn't about perfection. It was about telling the truth, even when the truth was ugly. The notes came differently this time. Not perfect. His fingers were out of practice, and he missed a few of the more intricate passages, but honest. The Adagio sostenuto wasn't water anymore. It was weight. It was the sound of walking through days that all looked the same, of dreams deferred so long they'd started to rot, of hands that remembered beauty even when they were too tired to reach for it. The room behind him went silent. Marcus played through the first movement, his eyes closing as muscle memory took over. The piano was better than any instrument he'd touched in his life, responsive, warm, forgiving in ways he didn't deserve. Under his hands, Beethoven's notes transformed from symbols on a page into something raw and breathing. The triplet figures rolled like someone walking alone at night. The melody lines sang with a kind of resigned sorrow that he understood in his bones, the sorrow of still being alive when part of you had died years ago. When he reached the final measure, he held the last chord longer than the notation suggested, letting it ring out until it faded into the silence of the enormous house. The resonance lingered in the air like smoke, like something you could almost touch if you reached out fast enough. He opened his eyes. His hands were shaking worse than before, and he realized there were tears on his face. He wiped them quickly, hoping no one had seen. The old man was staring at him, his phone forgotten in his hand. Behind him, the guests had gathered in the doorway, wine glasses held still, conversations abandoned. A woman with silver hair had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright with unshed tears. A younger man in an expensive sweater had set his glass down on a side table, his full attention fixed on Marcus in a way that made him want to disappear. "Who are you?" the old man asked, and his voice was completely different now, stripped of its earlier condescension, raw with something Marcus couldn't identify. Wonder, maybe, or recognition. "Nobody," Marcus said, standing up too quickly. The bench scraped against the marble with a sound that made him wince. "I'm nobody. Can you sign for the package, please?" The old man didn't move. You played that like... He stopped, shook his head as if trying to clear it. Where did you study? It doesn't matter. Marcus grabbed his phone, pulled up the delivery app with fingers that felt numb. I need to go. I have 4 more stops. Wait. The old man reached out, not touching Marcus, but blocking his path with the kind of unconscious entitlement that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. I'm James Ashford. I'm on the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Have been for 30 years. That's why... He gestured toward the other room. We're hosting a fundraising committee, and you just walked into my house and played Beethoven like you've lived every note of it. Marcus felt something close in his throat. I need you to sign. How much do you make? Ashford interrupted. With this job, delivering packages. That's not... How much? Marcus's hands clenched around his phone hard enough that the case cracked slightly. About $30,000 a year. Before taxes. Look, I don't know what you're trying to do here, but I can't... I'm trying to understand why someone with your ability is delivering cheese to my house instead of performing. Ashford's eyes were fierce now, almost angry, like Marcus's existence was a personal insult to the natural order of things. That wasn't the playing of an amateur. That was, you've had serious training, conservatory level, and you're working a gig economy job? The truth sat in Marcus's chest like a stone. He could feel the weight of it, the years of silence and suppressed longing and choices made in desperation. He could feel his mother's absence like a missing tooth, something his tongue kept finding over and over, expecting it to be there and finding only empty space. My mother got sick, Marcus said, his voice flat. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. No insurance. I was accepted to Juilliard, but I deferred to take care of her. She died anyway. By the time I could think about going back, I'd already aged out of most scholarship programs, and I had $40,000 in medical debt. That was 7 years ago. This is my life now. The words came out mechanical, practiced from repetition. He'd told this story before, to himself mostly, late at night when he couldn't sleep and the what-ifs crowded his brain like uninvited guests. But saying it out loud to strangers made it real in a way that hurt worse than the silent version. Ashford's face went very still. Behind him, the silver-haired woman was crying silently, tears running down her cheeks unchecked. The younger man had looked away, staring at the floor like he'd witnessed something too intimate for strangers. I'm sorry, Ashford said quietly, and Marcus heard something genuine in his voice. Not pity exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that sometimes life destroyed you for no good reason. Everyone's sorry. Marcus pushed past him, grabbed the package, shoved his phone forward. Please just sign, I need to go. Ashford took the phone, signed with his finger on the screen, the motion slow and deliberate. But before Marcus could take it back, he said, I want you to play again, at our gala, next month. We're showcasing emerging artists. The fee is $5,000, plus exposure to every major arts patron in the city. Marcus stared at him. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Ashford handed the phone back. Here. He pulled out a business card, actual paper, thick and expensive, with raised lettering that Marcus could feel under his thumb. This is my personal number. Call me, or don't. But you're wasting something precious, and I don't know if that's tragedy or crime, but I know I can't walk away from it. Marcus took the card. It felt like accepting something dangerous, something that could detonate his carefully constructed life of low expectations and managed disappointments. The card was warm from Ashford's pocket, and Marcus could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne on it. I can't, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. But you will, Ashford replied, his eyes knowing, because you know what I know. That kind of playing doesn't die, it just waits. And 7 years is a long time to keep something that powerful locked away. Marcus left without answering, the package delivered, the card burning in his pocket like a live coal. As he walked to his car, a 15-year-old Honda, with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that only opened from the inside, he could still feel the piano under his fingers, the way the notes had come back like they'd never left, like the 7 years had been nothing but a held breath. He sat in the driver's seat and pulled up his next delivery. His hands were still shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from something much more dangerous, hope. And hope, Marcus had learned the hard way, was the most expensive emotion you could afford to feel. The business card sat on Marcus's kitchen counter for 3 days before he touched it again. His apartment was in Pilsen, a neighborhood where the rent was just barely affordable and the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbor's television every night. The kitchen was barely bigger than a closet, the refrigerator hummed too loud, and the radiator only worked intermittently, clanging through the night like a ghost with unfinished business. The whole place smelled faintly of cooking oil from the taqueria downstairs, a smell that had seeped into his clothes and furniture until he'd stopped noticing it. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 17, but it was the life he had. And for 7 years, that had been enough. It had to be enough. Because hoping for more meant risking the kind of disappointment that could break you permanently. On the 4th day, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually debt collectors, calling about bills he couldn't pay with voices that managed to be both bored and accusatory at the same time, but something made him swipe to accept. Marcus Thompson. A woman's voice, professional, brisk, the kind of voice that belonged to someone whose problems could be solved with phone calls and proper scheduling. Yeah? This is Catherine Wright. I'm Mr. Ashford's executive assistant. He asked me to follow up about the gala performance. Have you had a chance to consider his offer? Marcus leaned against his kitchen counter, staring at the water stain on his ceiling that looked like a map of a country that didn't exist. Look, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested. Mr. Ashford mentioned you might say that. Catherine's voice softened slightly, losing some of its professional edge. He also mentioned you were concerned about the financial logistics. We can cover any costs associated with preparation, practice space, clothing for the performance, even coaching if you'd like. The $5,000 performance fee would be paid half up front, half after. Marcus's grip tightened on his phone. $2,500 up front. That was more than he'd saved in the last 2 years combined. That was brake pads and rent and maybe even a dentist appointment for the tooth that had been bothering him for months. I haven't played seriously in 7 years, he said. I can't just walk onto a stage and perform for Chicago's elite. I'd embarrass everyone involved. Mr. Ashford doesn't think so. He said your playing was the most emotionally authentic performance he'd heard in years. Catherine paused, and Marcus heard papers rustling in the background. He also said to tell you that opportunity doesn't usually knock twice, but when it does, only a fool leaves the door locked. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Tell Mr. Ashford I'll think about it. I'll call you back in 3 days, Catherine said. In the meantime, I'm emailing you the gala details and some potential pieces to consider. Just look at them. That's all we're asking. She hung up before Marcus could respond. The email arrived within minutes. Marcus opened it on his phone, scrolling through the formal invitation to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's annual Spring Gala, April 15th, 5 weeks away. The venue was the historic Symphony Center downtown, a space that seated over 2,000 people. The theme was Emerging Voices, a showcase of undiscovered classical talent. Marcus laughed bitterly at that. Emerging implied you were on your way up. He'd been submerged for 7 years. At the bottom of the email was a list of suggested pieces. Most were standard repertoire: Chopin Nocturne, Liszt Etudes, Rachmaninoff Preludes. But one stood out: Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8 in C minor, Op. 13, the Pathétique. Marcus set his phone down and laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed wrong in his empty apartment. The Pathétique. Of course. Another Beethoven sonata, this one even more technically demanding than the Moonlight. The second movement was one of the most beautiful pieces ever written, but it required absolute control, a delicate touch that he wasn't sure his hands remembered. And the first and third movements were brutal, fast, furious, demanding a level of technical facility that took months to build. His phone buzzed, a text from his younger sister, Danny. "Mom's death anniversary is next week. You still planning to visit the grave?" Marcus stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. He'd forgotten. 7 years, and somehow he'd let the date slip past him in the chaos of delivery schedules and rent deadlines and the exhausting work of just surviving. What kind of son forgot the anniversary of his mother's death? He texted back, "Yeah, Saturday morning." Her response came immediately. "Can we talk? I miss you, and I'm worried about you." They hadn't spoken properly in months. Danny was in her 2nd year at Northwestern, studying engineering on a full scholarship. The successful sibling, the one who'd managed to escape the gravity of their family's circumstances. She still carried guilt about it, Marcus knew. Guilt that she'd gotten to pursue her dreams while his had died with their mother. Guilt that she was thriving while he was barely surviving. "This weekend," he texted. "Promise." He put his phone down and looked around his apartment. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph of his mother, taken before she got sick. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hands mid-gesture the way they always were when she talked, animated, alive, fully present. She'd been a middle school music teacher, the kind who stayed late to help kids who couldn't afford private lessons. The kind who believed music was a human right, not a luxury. The kind who'd worked herself to exhaustion and still somehow found the energy to sit and listen to Marcus practice for hours. Marcus walked to the photograph, touched the frame gently. "What would you tell me to do?" He asked the empty apartment, his voice barely above a whisper. But he knew the answer. She'd tell him to play. She'd tell him that fear was just love turned inside out, and that the things we're most afraid of losing are the things worth fighting for. She'd tell him that wasting a gift was worse than losing it, that at least loss had dignity, while waste was just slow suicide. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at his ceiling, listening to his neighbor's television through the wall. Some game show, the artificial enthusiasm of the host punctuated by canned laughter. He thought about Ashford's offer, about the piano under his fingers, about the way the music had felt like coming home after years of exile. He thought about his mother's face, the last time she'd heard him play, 3 weeks before she died. He'd played for her in her hospital room. The nurses had let him bring in a keyboard, and she'd smiled through the pain, her eyes bright with morphine and love. "That's my son," she'd whispered afterward. "That's my beautiful son." What would she think of him now? 34 years old, delivering packages, living in an apartment that was slowly killing him by inches, his dreams so thoroughly buried that he'd convinced himself he didn't have them anymore. Marcus rolled over, pulled his pillow over his head and tried to sleep. But the music kept playing in his head. Beethoven's notes, insistent and demanding, refusing to be silenced. On Saturday, Marcus drove out to the cemetery in Aurora, the sky overcast and threatening rain. Danny was already there, standing by their mother's grave with a small bouquet of yellow roses, their mother's favorite. She'd cut her hair short since he'd last seen her, and she looked older, more like their mother than ever. She was wearing jeans and a Northwestern sweatshirt, and Marcus felt a surge of pride looking at her, at what she'd become despite everything. "Hey, stranger," she said, smiling sadly. "Hey." Marcus hugged her, holding on longer than usual. She smelled like coffee and some floral shampoo, like normalcy and success, and all the things he'd stopped believing he deserved. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the simple granite headstone, Elena Thompson, 1962-2018. Beloved mother, teacher, friend. The cemetery was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. Other graves stretched out in neat rows, each one a story ended, a life compressed into dates and brief descriptions. "I got a weird opportunity," Marcus said finally. "Some billionaire heard me play and wants me to perform at a gala." Danny turned to look at him, her eyes widening. "Marcus, that's incredible. It's terrifying. I haven't performed in 7 years. What if I've forgotten everything? What if I get up there and freeze? What if you're still as good as you used to be?" Danny interrupted. "Better even. What if this is the universe finally giving you back what it took away?" Marcus shook his head. "The universe doesn't work like that. It doesn't keep score. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left." "You know what Mom would say to that?" Danny's voice was fierce now, vibrating with an anger Marcus hadn't heard from her before. "She'd say you're already paying the price of not trying, that working yourself into the ground for 30 grand a year is its own kind of expensive, that you're choosing safety over life, and safety is just another word for slow death." "It's stable," Marcus protested weakly. "It's dying slowly." Danny grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "Marcus, I've watched you disappear piece by piece for 7 years. You think I don't notice? You think I don't see how you've made yourself small enough to fit into a life that was never supposed to be yours? You were meant for stages and concert halls and making people feel things they didn't know they could feel, and instead you're delivering cheese to rich people's houses and telling yourself it's fine." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He pulled away, staring out at the rows of graves. "What if I fail? What if you succeed?" Danny countered. "What if you walk onto that stage and remember who you used to be? What if you prove to yourself that those 7 years didn't erase everything? What if—" Her voice cracked. "What if you finally let yourself be happy again?" Marcus felt tears burn his eyes. "I don't know if I remember how." "Then learn," Danny said softly. "Start small. Take the gig. Practice. Show up. See what happens. But please, please stop punishing yourself for surviving. Mom didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life in purgatory. She died believing you were going to do amazing things. Don't prove her wrong." They spent another hour at the cemetery, talking about smaller things. Danny's classes, her new boyfriend who was apparently allergic to everything, Marcus's terrible landlord who'd promised to fix the radiator 6 months ago and hadn't. But the conversation about the gala hung between them, unresolved, heavy with implication. When Marcus drove back to his apartment, he found himself taking a detour. He ended up in front of the Chicago Music Academy, a community music school on the north side. Through the windows, he could see a young girl at a piano, her teacher leaning over her shoulder, correcting her hand position. The girl was maybe 10, concentrating so hard her tongue stuck out slightly. Marcus watched her play, some simple piece, probably a beginner's exercise. But she played it with complete commitment, like it was the most important thing in the world, and maybe it was. Maybe that's what music was supposed to be, not a career or a dream or a lost possibility, but just the act of making sound, of reaching for beauty, even when your hands were small and clumsy and you missed half the notes. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number on Ashford's card. Ashford answered on the second ring, his voice warm. "I was wondering when you'd call. I need to know something first," Marcus said. "Why me? You could have any trained pianist in the city. Professional musicians who haven't spent 7 years delivering packages. Why are you doing this? Ashford was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. My son was a pianist. Brilliant, technically perfect, everything a father could want. He died in a car accident 20 years ago. He was 26. He paused, and Marcus heard him take a shaky breath. And sometimes I wonder what he would have become if he'd lived long enough to stop playing perfectly and start playing honestly. You did that in my foyer. You played like someone who'd lost everything and found it again in those notes. That's what art is supposed to be, not perfection. Truth. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Ashford's grief mixing with his own. I'll do it, but I need help. I need somewhere to practice, and I need someone to tell me I'm not completely insane for trying this. You have it, Ashford said immediately. All of it. Catherine will arrange everything. Welcome back, Marcus. Welcome home. After he hung up, Marcus sat in his car outside the music school and cried, not from sadness, but from the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, with no choice but to jump. The girl in the window was still playing, still reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp yet. But she kept trying, kept reaching, kept believing that eventually her hands would grow large enough to hold what her heart already understood. Marcus started his car and drove home. Ashford's business card still in his pocket, the decision made, the door unlocked. Now he just had to figure out how to walk through it. The practice room Ashford arranged was in a private studio space near Lincoln Park, the kind of place where serious musicians paid by the hour for access to concert-quality instruments. Marcus's allocated time was every evening from 6 to 9, 3 hours of uninterrupted access to a Steinway Model D that sang under his fingers like nothing he'd ever played. It was also, he quickly discovered, 3 hours every evening of confronting exactly how much he'd lost. The first week was brutal. His fingers cramped after 30 minutes, the muscles protesting movements they'd forgotten. The technical passages that had once come easily now felt like climbing a mountain with broken legs. The pathetique's opening, those dramatic octaves and rapid runs, sounded muddy and uncontrolled under his hands, like he was fighting the piano instead of playing it. The second movement, which required such delicate touch, came out harsh and mechanical, all the beauty crushed under the weight of his anxiety. His back ached from hunching over the keys. His delivery job meant he spent all day on his feet, and by the time he got to the practice room, his body was already exhausted. He'd show up with fast food wrappers and cold coffee, wolfing down dinner between exercises, his hands shaking from fatigue and caffeine. On the fourth day, he threw his sheet music across the room in frustration. It scattered against the far wall, pages drifting to the floor like broken promises. That bad, huh? Marcus spun around. A woman stood in the doorway, maybe 40, with close-cropped natural hair and a cello case slung over her shoulder. She was smiling, but not unkindly. Her eyes held the kind of understanding that came from personal experience with failure. "Sorry," Marcus said, scrambling to pick up the scattered pages. "I didn't know anyone else was here. I'm in room B. Heard you struggling through the wall." She walked in, set her cello case down with practiced ease. "I'm Simone, and you're the delivery driver James Ashford is betting his reputation on." Marcus froze, sheet music crinkling in his hands. "How do you know about that?" Chicago's classical music scene is smaller than you'd think. Word gets around when someone like Ashford takes interest in an unknown. Simone leaned against the piano, studying him with an intensity that made Marcus want to look away. "He told the board you're going to be the highlight of the gala. That's a lot of pressure for someone who hasn't performed in 7 years. Tell me about it." Marcus sat back down at the bench, deflated. His hands ached, and there was a blister forming on his right thumb from the repeated octave passages. I don't know what he heard in me. Every time I try to play this piece, it sounds like exactly what it is, someone who's forgotten how to do this. "Can I listen?" Simone asked. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He started the Pathetique's first movement again, forcing his way through the opening bars. The music came out angry and frustrated, all sharp edges with no control. He made it through about 2 minutes before Simone held up her hand. "Stop," she said gently. "You're playing like you hate the piano." "I don't hate it. Your hands do." Simone pulled up a chair, settling in like she had all the time in the world. "You're fighting the instrument instead of working with it. Every note sounds like you're trying to prove something. But to who? The piano doesn't care. Beethoven's been dead for 200 years. The audience isn't here yet. So who are you angry at?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "That's not, I'm just out of practice." "Bullshit." Simone's voice was kind but firm, cutting through his defenses with surgical precision. "I've heard out of practice. This is different. This is someone playing like they're trying to punish themselves." She paused, her eyes softening. "James told me about your mother, about Juilliard. I'm sorry. That's a hell of a thing to carry." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, like a door that had been locked so long the hinges had rusted shut. "I gave it up for her. 3 years of conservatory, full scholarship waiting at Juilliard, a future that everyone said was guaranteed. And she died anyway. 7 years of my life, and it didn't matter. She still died. And I'm still here, delivering packages and pretending I made the right choice. So now you're playing like you want to prove it was worth it," Simone said quietly. "Like if you're good enough now, it'll justify what you sacrificed. Like the music owes you something for the years you lost. But that's not how it works. The sacrifice happened. Your mother still died. And no amount of perfect playing will change that." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stared at his hands, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. Scarred from handling packages, calloused in all the wrong places, still reaching for something they weren't sure existed anymore. These hands had held his mother's hand while she died. These hands had signed away his Juilliard acceptance. These hands had learned how to carry boxes instead of beauty. "Then what's the point?" he asked, his voice breaking. "The point is, you stop trying to make it meaningful and just let it be what it is." Simone stood up, walked to the window overlooking the Chicago street below. "Music doesn't save anybody. It doesn't justify sacrifice. It doesn't make pain worthwhile. But it's honest, and sometimes honesty is the only thing we have left." She turned back to him, her expression fierce. "Play the second movement, the Adagio Cantabile, and don't think about your mother or Juilliard or proving anything. Just play it like you're telling a story to someone who needs to hear it. Play it like you're having a conversation with the only person in the world who understands." Marcus turned to the second movement, that heartbreakingly beautiful melody. He placed his fingers on the keys and closed his eyes. Instead of thinking about technical perfection or emotional depth or what it all meant, he thought about his mother sitting in their cramped apartment, listening to him practice. He thought about how she'd never asked him to sacrifice his dreams for her, how he'd done it anyway, because love wasn't a choice, it was the only possible answer. He thought about how she'd told him, days before she died, that he'd given her the most precious gift, knowing her son had become the kind of man who chose love over ambition. The melody unfolded like a prayer, simple and honest. The left hand provided a steady pulse, while the right hand sang with a kind of gentle sorrow. He missed a note in the third measure, but instead of stopping, he let it be wrong, let the mistake become part of the story. Because life was full of wrong notes, and the point wasn't to play perfectly, it was to keep playing anyway. When he finished, Simone was smiling, and there were tears on her cheeks. "There," she said softly, "that's what Ashford heard. Play like that at the gala and you'll be fine." "I messed up," Marcus said. "Everyone messes up. That's not what people remember." Simone picked up her cello case, paused at the door. "They remember how you made them feel, and just now you made me feel like I understood something true about being human, about losing things and surviving them, about the way love outlasts everything, even death." She smiled. "That's worth more than perfect technique. That's worth everything." After she left, Marcus sat at the piano for a long time, staring at the keys. Then he started playing again, and this time he wasn't fighting anymore. He was just telling the truth, one note at a time. The weeks passed in a blur of practice sessions and delivery shifts. Marcus's body ached constantly, from hunching over the piano, from lifting packages, from sleeping badly in his thin-walled apartment where the radiator clanged and his neighbor's television never seemed to turn off. He existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion, running on coffee and determination and the slowly growing conviction that maybe, just maybe, he could actually do this. The pathétique began to come back to him. Not perfectly. There were still passages that felt awkward, moments where his hands couldn't quite execute what his mind heard. But honestly, he learned to work with his limitations instead of fighting them, to find beauty in the imperfections, to let the years of struggle inform the music instead of diminishing it. Danny came to hear him practice one night, sneaking into the studio during his session. He didn't know she was there until he finished a run-through of the entire sonata and heard her clapping from the doorway. "Jesus, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I forgot how good you were." "I'm not as good as I used to be," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're better. You're playing like someone who's actually lived. The old you was technically perfect but emotionally empty. This you," she shook her head, "this you is real." 3 days before the gala, Catherine called. "We need to do a dress rehearsal," she said. "Tomorrow night at Symphony Center, 7 o'clock. Mr. Ashford wants to hear you perform on the actual stage." Marcus's stomach dropped. "The actual stage? You'll need to get comfortable with the space," Catherine said practically. "And we'll handle final logistics, what you're wearing, when you'll arrive, where you'll wait. Consider it a preview, a chance to work out any nerves before the real thing." The next night, Marcus stood in the wings of Symphony Center's stage, staring out at the empty hall. 2,000 seats stretched out before him, a row after row, rising up into shadows. The stage itself was massive, the Steinway positioned at its center like an island. The space smelled like old wood and acoustics designed for perfection, and Marcus felt like an imposter, like someone who'd wandered into a cathedral wearing street clothes. "It's overwhelming at first," Ashford said, appearing beside him. He was wearing casual clothes, khakis and a sweater, but still carried himself with the kind of dignity that money and education imparted. "I remember bringing my son here when he was 16. He took one look at this hall and nearly ran back to the car." "But he didn't," Marcus said. "No, he walked out there and played Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and it was the most terrified I'd ever seen him. And the most alive." Ashford's voice was distant, lost in memory. "I think about that performance all the time. How fear and joy can look exactly the same when you're doing something that matters. How the things that scare us most are usually the things most worth doing." Marcus walked onto the stage slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The stage lights were blinding, turning the audience into a void. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, let his hands rest on the keys. The instrument was perfectly tuned, responsive to the slightest touch, and Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for whoever maintained it, whoever made sure it was always ready for moments like this. "Whenever you're ready," Ashford called from somewhere in the darkness. Marcus began the pathétique. The opening bars crashed through the hall with startling power, the Steinway's sound filling every corner of the space, ricocheting off the carefully designed acoustics. But then the second movement came, and Marcus played it the way Simone had taught him, not as a performance, but as a conversation. The melody sang out clear and honest, filling the enormous hall with something intimate and human. He played all three movements without stopping, losing himself in the music. The final movement was fierce and insistent, Beethoven refusing to surrender to despair, pushing forward with relentless energy. Marcus's hands flew across the keys, executing passages that a month ago had seemed impossible. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed felt sacred, like the moment after prayer, when you're waiting to see if anyone was listening. Ashford's applause echoed through the empty hall, joined by a few others, Catherine and some board members who'd apparently been watching. "You're ready," he called out. "More than ready." But Marcus wasn't sure. As he stood up from the piano, looking out at all those empty seats that would soon be filled with Chicago's wealthiest arts patrons, he felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. What if he froze? What if his hands cramped? What if, in that moment of truth, all the practice and preparation meant nothing, and he was just a delivery driver, pretending to be something he'd stopped being years ago? That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the ways he could fail, forgotten passages, technical mistakes, the humiliation of proving that some dreams die for good reasons. At 3 a.m, he got up and paced his apartment, too wired to rest, his body vibrating with anxiety and anticipation. His phone buzzed. A text from Danny. "Can't sleep either. Excited for you. Scared for you. Mostly excited. Mom would be so proud." Marcus stared at the message, feeling tears burn his eyes. He thought about his mother's face the last time she'd heard him play, her smile even through the pain, the way she'd said, "That's my son. That's my beautiful son." He texted back, "I'm terrified." Danny's response came immediately. "Good. That means you're alive. That means it matters. Go be alive, Marcus. Mom's already proud. Now make yourself proud." Marcus set his phone down and walked to his window, looking out at the Pilsen street below. A delivery truck was making early morning rounds, its driver visible in the cab's light. Probably listening to music or podcasts, probably thinking about rent and bills and all the small survivals that add up to a life. That could have been his whole life, just driving, delivering, surviving, safe, small, contained, known. Instead, in less than 48 hours, he'd be standing on one of the most famous stages in America, playing for people who knew more about classical music than he'd ever learn, risking everything he'd carefully protected for 7 years. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and whispered to his reflection, "Please don't let me forget why I'm doing this." But he already knew. He was doing it because staying safe had become its own kind of death, and at least this way, if he failed, he'd fail while trying to become something more than the sum of his losses. He was doing it because his mother had believed in him, and maybe, just maybe, he could learn to believe in himself again, too. The day of the gala arrived cold and bright, Lake Michigan visible through Symphony Center's tall windows like a gray promise. Marcus arrived early, at Catherine's instruction, wearing the tuxedo the orchestra had provided. It fit perfectly, tailored to his frame by someone who understood how clothes could transform you, expensive fabric that felt foreign against his skin, but also, somehow, right. He barely recognized himself in the dressing room mirror. This well-dressed man, with nervous eyes, looked like someone who belonged on a stage, someone whose hands were made for pianos instead of packages. "You clean up well," Simone said, appearing in the doorway. She was wearing a formal black dress, her cello already set up backstage for her own performance later in the evening. "How are you holding up?" "I threw up twice this morning," Marcus admitted, "and I couldn't eat anything. My hands won't stop shaking." "That's the spirit," she smiled. Listen, whatever happens out there, remember, you've already won just by showing up. Everything else is just details. But it didn't feel like details. It felt like everything. The gala began at 7. Marcus was scheduled to perform at 8:30 after the initial speeches and the dinner service. He spent the hour before his performance pacing in the green room, running through the Pathétique's difficult passages in his mind, his fingers moving unconsciously against his thighs. Other performers came and went. A soprano who sang scales to warm up, a violinist who seemed completely calm, a string quartet that laughed and joked like they performed at galas every week. Marcus felt like an alien among them, an imposter who'd somehow fooled everyone into thinking he belonged. At 8:15, Catherine came to get him. "You're up in 10 minutes. Mr. Ashford wants to see you first." Ashford was waiting in the wings, looking elegant in his tuxedo, his face unreadable. For a moment, Marcus saw him not as a billionaire arts patron, but as a father who'd lost his son, who was trying to reclaim something through Marcus's performance. The weight of that expectation felt crushing. "I wanted to tell you something before you go out there," Ashford said quietly. "No matter what happens tonight, you've already given me something valuable. You've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Not for the technical perfection, or the prestigious composers, or the social connections, but for moments like what happened in my foyer, when someone plays like their life depends on it, because in a way, it does." Marcus's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can do this. What if I—" "You don't have to know." Ashford placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle. "You just have to walk out there and tell the truth. That's all music is, truth set to notes. Your truth, the truth of these 7 years, of everything you've lost and survived and become." From the stage, Marcus could hear the evening's host introducing him. The voice was smooth, professional, designed to make everything sound important. "Our next performer is making his debut with us tonight. Marcus Thompson is a classically trained pianist who left the performance world 7 years ago, but has recently returned to share his gift with us. He'll be performing Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8 in C minor, the Pathétique. Marcus's legs felt like water as he walked onto the stage. The applause was polite, curious, the sound of people withholding judgment until they had reason to offer it. The lights were exactly as bright as he remembered from rehearsal, turning the audience into a sea of shadows and reflected jewelry. 2,000 people, maybe more. All of them watching him, waiting to judge whether this experiment of James Ashford's would be triumph or disaster. He could see Danny in the 3rd row, next to Ashford. His sister was wearing a dress he'd never seen before, her hair done up, looking like she belonged in this world in a way Marcus never had. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod, and somehow that helped. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench with trembling hands, looked out at the audience and thought about every reason he shouldn't be here. The 7 years of silence, the medical debt still hanging over him, the abandoned dreams, the safer, smaller life he could have continued living, the delivery job that would be waiting for him if this all went wrong. Then he thought about his mother's face, her smile, her certainty that music was worth every sacrifice it demanded. He thought about the girl he'd seen through the window of the music school, playing with complete commitment, even though her hands were small and clumsy. He thought about Simone's words, "Music doesn't save anybody, but it's honest." His hands found the opening notes of the Pathétique, and the music crashed through the hall like breaking glass. The grave opening was dark and dramatic, each chord weighted with 7 years of suppressed emotion. Then the allegro section began, and Marcus let his hands fly across the keys, trusting the muscle memory that had survived 7 years of dormancy, trusting that something in him had been waiting for this moment all along. The first movement was fire and fury, Beethoven's anger at the world channeled through Marcus's fingers. He missed 2 notes in the development section, heard them clearly, wrong notes that stood out like scars, but pushed through, letting the mistakes become part of the emotional landscape rather than technical failures. The recapitulation came back strong, and the movement ended with a flourish that made the piano sing and the hall resonate with sound that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading. The audience was silent, attentive in a way that felt different from polite interest. Marcus allowed himself one breath, wiped his palms on his pants, beneath the keyboard where no one could see, before beginning the second movement. The Adagio cantabile was where Marcus had been most afraid of failing. It required such control, such delicate emotional nuance. But as the first gentle notes emerged, something shifted inside him. He stopped thinking about the audience, the mistakes, the fear. He started thinking about his mother, about Danny, about everyone who'd believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. He thought about Simone, telling him to just be honest. The melody unfolded like a conversation between his 2 hands, the right singing with gentle insistence, while the left provided a steady heartbeat. Marcus played it the way he'd learned in that practice room, not as a performance but as a story, the story of loss and survival, of dreams deferred and hope rediscovered, of the long road between giving up and trying again. The story of loving someone enough to sacrifice everything and learning to live with both the choice and the loss. He could feel the audience leaning forward, the quality of their attention changing from polite interest to genuine engagement. Someone in the front rows was crying, he noticed peripherally, an older woman with her hand pressed to her mouth. Others had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that meant they'd forgotten they were in a concert hall and were lost in something personal, something that spoke to their own hidden griefs and lost possibilities. The second movement ended with a whisper, the final notes fading into silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could hear someone in the audience take a shaky breath. Then the third movement began, the rondo, with its driving, almost frantic energy. This was Beethoven refusing to accept defeat, pushing forward despite everything. Marcus attacked the rapid passages with everything he had left, his hands moving faster than his conscious mind could track. The technical demands were immense, but he'd practiced them thousands of times over the past month, had worn grooves into his muscle memory, and they emerged now with startling clarity. The music built and built, relentless and determined. This was survival music, the sound of refusing to stay down, of getting up one more time even when every part of you wanted to quit. Marcus leaned into it, felt his body moving with the rhythm, forgot entirely that he was being watched. The coda accelerated, the tempo driving toward its inevitable conclusion. Marcus's hands flew, executing runs that would have been impossible a month ago, that maybe shouldn't be possible now, but somehow were. The final measures crashed through the hall with defiant joy, and the last chord rang out, triumphant and unresolved, filling the space with vibration. Silence. For one terrible moment that stretched like eternity, Marcus thought he'd failed, that the performance had been a disaster, and the audience was too shocked or disappointed to respond. His heart hammered. His hands stayed frozen on the keys. Then the applause started. It began in the front rows and rolled backward like a wave, growing louder and louder until it filled the entire hall with sound that was almost physical. People stood, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds, until the entire audience was on its feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy. Marcus sat frozen at the piano, his hands still on the keys, unable to process what was happening. Ashford was in the front row, applauding with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. Beside him, the silver-haired woman from the party was crying openly, her mascara running. Danny was there too, standing and clapping, her smile brilliant even from a distance, her own tears catching the light. The applause went on, showing no signs of stopping. Someone in the balcony shouted, "Bravo!" and others took it up, the word echoing through the hall. Marcus's vision blurred with tears he couldn't hold back anymore. He stood awkwardly, bowed like he'd been taught years ago in conservatory, and walked off stage on legs that barely supported him. As soon as he reached the wings, his knees gave out. He sat down hard on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, his whole body vibrating with adrenaline and relief and something that felt dangerously close to joy. Simone appeared beside him, crouching down with her dress pooling around her. "Breathe," she said quietly. "Just breathe. You did it." "Did that actually happen?" Marcus asked, his voice coming out broken. "It happened." She was grinning, her eyes bright. "You magnificent bastard. You actually did it. And it was perfect. Not technically perfect. Fuck technical perfection. But emotionally perfect. You made 2,000 people feel something real. That's all that matters." The rest of the evening passed in a blur that Marcus would later struggle to reconstruct. He was introduced to what felt like hundreds of people. Donors, musicians, critics, arts administrators. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were, to ask where he'd been hiding all these years. Business cards piled up in his pockets until he had to start putting them in his jacket's inner pocket, then his pants pockets, until he was weighted down with small rectangles of expensive paper covered in embossed letters. Multiple people asked about representation, about future performances, about recording opportunities. Someone from the Ravinia Festival wanted to book him for their summer series. A reviewer from the Chicago Tribune asked if he could arrange an interview. A woman from the Music Institute of Chicago asked if he'd consider teaching. Ashford found him near the end of the night, holding 2 glasses of champagne, his eyes still red from crying. "Here," he said, handing one to Marcus. "You've earned this." "I don't know what to say," Marcus admitted. His voice was hoarse from emotion. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." "Then don't say anything." Ashford clinked his glass against Marcus's. "Just promise me you'll keep playing. Not because I'm asking, or because there's money in it, but because the world needs what you have to offer. We need people who can remind us what it means to be human." "It's not that simple," Marcus said. "I still have debt. I still have—" "The board wants to offer you a position," Ashford interrupted, his voice taking on a businesslike quality, even as his eyes remained emotional. "Associate artist in residence. It comes with a salary, 60,000 a year to start, access to our facilities, and opportunities to perform regularly. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to live on while you rebuild your career." He paused. "That is, if you want to rebuild your career. No pressure. But the option is there." Marcus stared at him, the champagne glass forgotten in his hand. 60,000. That was double what he made delivering packages. That was a life. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Ashford smiled, and in that moment he looked younger, like the grief he carried had loosened its grip slightly. "James, from accounting, already ran the numbers. We can make it work. You'd teach some master classes, perform at our educational outreach events, and have regular performance opportunities. Plus time to practice, to develop your repertoire, to become the musician you were always meant to be." Danny appeared at Marcus's elbow, grabbing his arm with fingers that dug in hard enough to bruise. "Did he just offer you a real job?" she demanded, her voice pitched high with excitement. "I think so." Marcus looked between them, feeling like reality was tilting sideways, like the room was spinning even though he'd only taken 1 sip of champagne. "Take it," Danny said fiercely. "Don't you dare hesitate. Don't you dare think about it. Take it and don't look back." Marcus thought about his apartment in Pilsen, the delivery app on his phone, the 7 years of carefully managed expectations. He thought about his mother's face, her certainty that some things were worth every risk. He thought about the feeling of playing that last chord, of hearing 2,000 people rise to their feet, of remembering what it felt like to be alive instead of just surviving. Marcus accepts the new opportunity, but needs time to process how dramatically his life has changed. After the concert, he walks through Chicago reflecting on his recognition, his mother's absence, his sister Danny's support, and the symbolic end of a chapter when he deletes the delivery app. Even though the debts and losses remain, something fundamental has shifted. His life has truly begun again. 3 months later, Marcus is living in a better apartment, performing in scheduled concerts, teaching music to underprivileged children, and rebuilding his career. More confident now, he accepts the challenge of preparing one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, despite his fear. He understands that his journey through loss, resilience, and renewal defines him as both an artist and a person. For the first time in years, he is no longer just surviving, but actively shaping a meaningful future, feeling at last that he belongs.